No, we actually coordinate donations on behalf of the district government. We work with all of you amazing grants managers across multiple district agencies, and we promote volunteerism and public-private partnerships really around service and making sure that we can advance good here in the nation's capital. And so you all are probably aware as well that Mayor Bowser has charged us with looking at how we collectively as an administration will focus on building back DC better, more resilient, more vibrant, and more equitable. And so as we embrace those principles and those priorities that serve DC, I thought, wow, what a fantastic opportunity to be able to share this great work that our longstanding partner, the Center for Nonprofit Advancement, has done as it relates to racial equity and grants management, particularly during these times of COVID-19. So I know that we can all say that things look different, that the nonprofit organizations that we've been working with, that the needs that they've had have been magnified and intensified, and that the expectations and the needs and the demands on us as grant-making agencies has even shifted. And so as we think about how we support these organizations going forward with finite resources that we have, with all of the kind of competitive, competing priorities and needs that organizations and our communities have, how can we respond in a way to make sure that our grant making, to make sure that our support and our investments are more equitable, and that we as a district government and that we as agency leads really understand the needs of organizations that are led by people of color and serving communities of color during this time. So I say to each of you, again, thank you so much for joining us and finding value in advance for what it is that we'll be discussing. I want to thank my team, our partnership and engagement team under Alexis Squire and Roll Lewis for coordinating and pulling this off in such a timely way. And to say thank you to Glenn and his team for being willing to come and share this information with these district leaders. And so with that, I will turn it over to Glenn to talk more about the Center for Nonprofit Advancement and to be able to share the findings of this really important study. And then just a friendly reminder, please, as soon as you come on, if you could go to the corner and mute yourselves on the phone. We would really appreciate if you could just take a moment to mute yourself on your phone or your devices. Thank you so much. Glenn?
Excellent. Thank you, Director Scales, and good morning to everyone on this particular Zoom this morning. It's great to see so many district leaders joining us to receive this data and to hear some of what the Center for Nonprofit Advancement has pulled forward in this really challenging time with both a health emergency and pandemic, as much as there has been a true demonstration of injustice, racial injustice with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many more. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to share a few words about the Center for Nonprofit Advancement before passing things to Liz Scott, who's a researcher with Brighter Strategies, a partner of ours from whom we commissioned this research, and then look forward to opening for some question and answer and some discussion. So quickly on the center, it's been since 1979 that we have been serving the District of Columbia as an association of nonprofits. We focus in 4 key areas. The first is capacity building for those organizations. The second for us is sparking collaboration amongst organizations with similar mission and focus. Advocacy is very important, as we are with City Council, also with federal government, to push for good practices that support nonprofits. And then finally, what we refer to as group buying. And group buying is really conducting and supporting all of the back office administrative services, from the financial management, the HR practices, providing health insurance for nonprofit organizations so they can continue to do so much more with less in most cases, which we've also seen during this pandemic. A couple things for us since the pandemic began: 2 major initiatives. One is what we refer to as our sector rebuilding campaign. It's a 3-year initiative focused on helping nonprofits to function in this new normal, providing crisis management technical assistance and a host of other capacity building and support. The other is the launch of our new Center for Race, Equity, justice and inclusion, which really focuses, as you heard, on racial equity across all lines, all sectors in the District of Columbia and surrounding region. So we're really excited about both of those things. What you will hear today and this morning is the initial research conducted for both. The research around the COVID-19 impact on organizations, and more importantly for this conversation, what we see and understand as race equity issues within organizations and what is preventing them from functioning at their highest level. I will say to you that the center is now supporting a bit over 800 nonprofits, diverse group in scale and size. We are also supporting nonprofits in Prince George's and Montgomery County and throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. With that, and with one big sort of happy Giving Tuesday, I'm going to pass things to Liz Scott, who is president and CEO of Brighter Strategies, to walk us through this data. And I'll also say to you that we're going to spend some time on the challenges that we so look you and I see that
Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt, Glenn. If everyone could ensure that their devices are muted, we're hearing some feedback. Perfect.
I apologize, Glenn. I realized as co-host I could mute everybody, and so I just did. So you are now muted as well. So if you wanted to finish your thought, feel free to do so, or I'll just jump right in. Okay, perfect. Thank you all. My name is Dr. Liz Scott. As Glenn mentioned, I'm with Brighter Strategies, and we're the organization that worked with the center to help pull this data together. And it's been a really wonderful collaborative process, pulling from partners all across the city to get this information out there. And there were a number of different partners that the center collaborated with, and I won't go through them all here, but you can see some of their logos and their names up here. And the outreach was just phenomenal. And so we really want to thank everyone who participated in the survey and also those who helped distribute the survey. The survey ended up going out to 1,021 key nonprofit organizations. So we particularly were looking for groups that touched multiple funders, that had multiple service delivery areas within the city. And we felt like we got a really good representation back from this data. And so what I thought I would do today is just take a couple moments this morning to walk through the survey data. And then I know anytime you look at a survey, you end up having more questions around, gosh, why did they answer it that way? And what did they think about this? So I'm sure you all will have tons of questions and we'll have a really good, rich dialogue and discussion. So of those 1,000 some odd organizations, we ended up with 255 specific organizations that touch different aspects, as I mentioned, so multiple funders, different capacity builders, and associations here in our community. We ended up with a pretty good representation and mix of these organizations. So each organization was asked to respond to the survey only once. So of those 255 organizations, those are all unique individual groups. About 53% of the people who responded were executive directors, about 30% were members of the leadership team, and then of course we had board chairs and others who responded as well. Within these organizations, there was a lot of diversity across the different geographies that they serve. So you can see here across the board, the most are serving Ward 8, and then you can see it sort of goes down to other counties here in Virginia, but really wide representation. We also had a wide representation as far as size of the organizations. And so you can see that there is a little bit of a grouping here around the $1 million mark, but we definitely had organizations from every different perspective, which is great. And then also we had a wide range across different industries within the nonprofit space. So you can see we had the most from education, human services, health and wellness, and housing, but also across the board, just some really nice representation. There were a couple themes that emerged from the survey that I thought I would take some time walking through. This first batch of themes was really around the impact of COVID. And I think that as you go through these, none of this will be surprising to anybody because we're all living in it right now, and we're all kind of experiencing the same thing. So, you know, I think that the items here in this section, as I mentioned, aren't going to surprise you. So I won't spend a lot of time here. But just to frame what people are experiencing right now, organizations, and again, to no surprise to anyone, but they are experiencing an increased need while simultaneously seeing significant gaps in services. So 55% of organizations saw an increase in demand, and 80% see that there are more significant gaps in their community than what they're actually able to provide service and support for. And so clearly the work of nonprofits was important before COVID, and it continues to be incredibly important. And our community is underserved, and we're not able to get to all the resources and to the individuals that we want to be able to serve. We also saw that more than half of the organizations have been impacted by funding. Again, not a surprise to people. Their ability to reach clients. There have been major shifts in energy for these organizations because suddenly they're offering new program offerings, they're rethinking strategies and tactics. And so there's just a lot of internal redesign for how this work is going to happen. And then of course there's increased cost because we're doing things differently and we're impacting and trying to reach communities in new ways. And so all those things impact the organization. And then on top of that, for some organizations that are volunteer run, volunteers were not as able to get out into the community. And so 51% of organizations lost their workforce, essentially, their volunteer base. So that was a huge impact for a number of these organizations. And as I mentioned, most of these organizations, not all of them, but most of them had major shifts in program delivery. So people were really creative and innovative about what they were doing. Some of them created new virtual programs. So 62% created new virtual programming. 56% were able to transition all their in-person programmings to virtual offerings. About half continued with in-person programming. They were not able to move to virtual, or their programming doesn't lend itself to being in a virtual environment. 25% created entirely new programs that had nothing to do with their mission or their core service, but they were emergency programs that they felt were really needed in the community, and they wanted to be able to jump in and offer that support. So there was a lot of new innovation that was happening within the space. And then, of course, the last impact here of COVID was that we had a huge drop in funding. So most organizations, the good news is that most of them were able to access one-time aid. It was actually 80%, so that was pretty positive. And as a result of getting that funding, 62% ended up not having to tap into their reserves, which again was also very positive. But 39% had to completely rely on operating reserves, and 42% saw a decrease in funding across the board. So we had this momentary blip where we had some money infusion, which helped, but it wasn't long-term, and it wasn't something that's going to sustain us in the long run. And so that's sort of the climate and the environment from a financial COVID perspective. In the midst of this environment, we really wanted to look at how racial inequities, how race impacts the organizations and the people being served. And unfortunately, what we found in our data was that there are racial inequities, and they do exist in both relief and in pandemic response. And so I want to spend a little bit more time on this portion of the slides, because I think this is really interesting and gives us some good information to think about how we want to support the city and the organizations that are supporting residents within this area. So the first interesting data point, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to share a number of really interesting data points, and the problem with them is they're simply data points. So I know you're going to have a lot of questions when you begin to go through this, and that's totally okay. We want to have that conversation with you, but just keep in mind, this is a static survey. It's a moment in time, and but it does give us some interesting things to think about from a service delivery perspective. So the first thing that we found was that there was statistically significant differences in furloughs and layoffs for Black-led organizations as opposed to white-led organizations. that's interesting. And of course, it begs the question, why? And then you want to dig a little bit deeper into the data to try to figure out what that resulted from. So what we saw was that 24% of organizations had to lay off or reduce staff or furlough staff. But within that 24%, when we break that down by race, 21% of African-American led organizations are expecting to continue to lay off staff, whereas that's only true in 10% of white-led organizations. And so that's an interesting piece that we would want to dig into a little bit more to try to figure out what's happening within these organizations from a resource perspective. The second thing that we saw within this area around racial inequity is that in wards 5 through 8, so if you remember, we asked which wards people served in, where they provided services, and specifically in wards 5 through 8, race was perceived as having a direct negative impact on people's ability to get funding. And specifically, it was organizations of color that were finding this negative impact as opposed to organizations that are white-led. And so again, that's an interesting finding, particularly looking at those wards in particular, to want to be able to drill down into that a little bit. And I see there's a question as to whether these slides have been made available. They are actually on the center's website, so they are publicly available if you'd like to go there, and I'm sure they'll be distributed as a result of this as well. One of the other things that we saw here is that there were differences in organizational needs between white-led organizations and then organizations led by a person of color. And so this is also interesting because in my mind, I think it ties back to the furloughing question, that depending on where people need support has a lot to do with how much staffing and how many resources that you have. So for African-American led organizations, you can see here at the bottom of the slide that 28% needed support with moving operations online. 29% needed support streamlining internal operations. And then interestingly, in the Asian Pacific Islander group, 50% there also needed support moving programs online. And in the Hispanic Latino group, they actually, 67% said that they needed leadership and executive coaching support. And so, and these numbers are interesting because they're statistically different. They're higher than what we saw in white-led organizations. And so there's obviously, I think, a resource gap here. Funding is being taken away. There's a gap in operational support. Staff are being furloughed, and it's creating a different experience or a different environment for African-American led organizations as compared to their white counterparts. So again, just some really interesting information that I think, gives us a good platform to begin to have conversations around bringing equity into our community and space. Another interesting finding here, which is actually pretty positive, is that when asked about your sense of community, so acknowledging that so much has happened in our lives and we're dealing with so many different things, how are you sort of feeling from a work perspective? Is it a friendly work environment? Do you feel like you have strong interconnected systems? Do you feel supported? And what we found was there was actually a stronger sense of community in Black-led organizations than in white-led organizations. So despite some of the issues with furloughing and budgets and operations, there's a stronger sense of unity and togetherness, and that's a really positive thing that I think needs to be expanded upon. So you can see here that 48% of Black-led organizations identified that they had a sense of community as compared to 31% of the white-led organizations. Okay, so the next area here was we wanted to dig a little bit deeper outside of just looking at racial inequities, but also having a sense of what are people doing from an internal perspective. So how are they engaging in their communities? How are they engaging and interacting with the need for social justice and DEI initiatives within their space? And so there were a couple interesting things that we found here that I want to expand a little bit. And I see there's a comment asking me if I could make the PowerPoint slides bigger. I can certainly do that. I believe on your Zoom screen, you can also adjust. There's a little like toggle line in the middle that you can slide in and out, and that'll also make the slides bigger from your perspective as well. Okay, so a couple things here under the racial equity. We found that people are having conversations around race and injustice, and so that's a positive thing. What's interesting about this data, though, is we asked people on this 5-point scale. So you can see this little balloon visual here. So on this 5-point scale, with 1 being, not at all, and 5 being absolutely, we're definitely doing this. We asked them, are you having conversations, courageous and inclusive conversations sparked by the recent murders of people of color? And on a 5-point scale, people scored 3.8. So yes, we're having these conversations. When asked if they felt equipped to take that and move into the community, the answer was a 1.3 on that same 5-point scale. So what it looks like is that people are having conversations internally, but they don't know how to operationalize that and how to bring that into the community, or how to engage their populations that they're serving in these conversations around race equity and social justice. So there's a lot of education here, I think, is what people are asking for, to be able to move this from an internal conversation to one that is more encompassing of the communities that they serve. The second thing that we saw here is that there are some gaps between demographics of organizational leadership and representing the communities that they actually serve. So to no surprise here, organizations that are led by a person of color are 6 times more likely to say that their organizational leadership structure aligns with the community that they serve. And organizations that are led by a board member who is also a person of color, they are 4 times more likely to say that they are aligned with the communities they serve. And what we saw is that there were differences there, whereas white-led organizations do not feel that they are as representational as the communities that they serve. So 56% of organizations led by a white executive director would like to see more diversity on their leadership team. And 40% of those organizations would also like to see their broader organizational composition be better aligned with the racial composition of the communities that they serve. So there's a lot of work there that is recognized and is in, I think, the process, but for white-led organizations, they don't feel like they're there yet. And I think some of that goes back to the slide that we shared earlier around the difference between having a conversation versus being able to apply that conversation. Another interesting thing that we saw here is that when we think about the need for DEI work, it's apparent, and it's much higher in white-led organizations, that there is more of a need to have these conversations around filling race and equity gaps. So 59% of organizations are planning on doing more significant work around race equity. So that's a good thing. 64% of organizations are doing something internally already, where they have internal DEI efforts. And interestingly, organizations with white-led executive directors were 2 times more likely to report that they did have plans to address race equity and inclusion. So it's something that's on people's radar. It's something that people are identifying as being something important. Many organizations are beginning to have these conversations. I think it's great that we're at 59%. I think it would be better if we were at a higher number, a higher percentage, but there's definitely the beginning of conversations that are happening across the board. One interesting thing, we did look at the data, not just by race, but also by gender. And there was one interesting statistic that came out here, is that for male-led organizations, so a male executive director, they were actually less likely or less willing to engage in DEI work than their female counterparts. And so that was a little bit interesting. I'm not sure exactly what we would do with that data, but it was an interesting finding that there seems to be less focus from a gender perspective. So 68% of female executive directors indicated that they were planning on doing some DEI work in the next 12 months, as compared to 26% of male executive directors. And so that's kind of interesting from that perspective. The last piece around this data that I wanted to talk through is, what happens next? So what do we think about the data that we've collected, and what are some of the needs for the future and some of the lessons learned? And there are a couple things that come from this. And I think the first thing is that the demand for nonprofit services is going to continue to grow. We know from this data that people believe that there's an 80% gap in services, that there's a lot of work and a lot of support out there that organizations and community partners need to be engaged in, but they don't have the resources for. And we don't necessarily see that need going away anytime soon. We see that need continuing. And so part of this, as we see here, as that need continues, 65% of organizations expect that there are going to have an increase in demand on their particular services. And then 87% of organizations believe that the thing that they need that's most important to them is funding. And that actually does not surprise me, because I think most organizations think funding is going to support them. But the question, I think, really is, what do we do with the funding, and how do we support our community the best way possible? How do we invest and build capacity with that funding? So I don't think it's so much a matter of necessarily handing someone a check, but really giving them the resources and the tools to be able to apply that check, to apply those monies in a way that are really helpful. And that's something that we saw, and which I think is the biggest takeaway here, is that the ability of an organization to actually pursue these DEI initiatives and to be successful in this space is really not about the funding. It's about them having the capacity to meet baseline operations. And so the idea is if they don't have the capacity to meet baseline, they can't then begin to think about these broader issues and systemic issues that are happening in our community. So what we saw here is that nonprofits that are requesting support for practicing DEI internally are more likely to expect that they're not going to have changes in staffing ratios. And most of them, 51% of them, believe that they're actually going to have an increase in staff support. So really what this means is that the organizations that have the capacity to do DEI work are not the organizations that are experiencing all of the furloughing and the operational divides. These are organizations that have their internal resources and can then focus those elements on the DEI work. So, again, it's not so much specifically about the check component, the money piece. It's really about investing in capacity building so that baseline operations can be met. And then with that, organizations can then take those next conversations to the next level. So anyway, so that's, I think, kind of an interesting perspective of what the data showed. I know that Glenn and Arias, you guys wanted to jump into some Q&A and some discussion. And so let me just pause here for a moment to see if you had any comments or reflections. I know there were a number of comments and questions that came out in the chat as well.
Liz, thank you. And thank you for moving through the data so efficiently. Quick question. I think it may make sense for us to spend a little time talking about the intentionality of the study. There was a good question. I think it was Dr. Christie, and I'll just say O, which everyone gives me because Ogilvy is a hard one as well. But the question was around the comparisons, how the comparisons were made to the organizations. For example, a 2 to 3 employee organization compared to one that may be larger, 50 plus employees, and how we were able to reduce for such research bias. So maybe talking a little bit about who we surveyed, who responded, and some of the process that helped us to qualify.
I would be happy to. Yeah. So, of the organizations, the process, and I'm going to go back to this partner slide. Essentially, we reached out to these different partner groups and asked them to identify their lists of who they fund, who they support, who, within the community are groups that they think are key organizations or organizations that they are funding within the Washington, D.C. region. And so when we got all those lists, we were able to cross-reference them and identify the organizations that we felt were a really good representation across all these different funding areas. And so those were the organizations that we ended up reaching out to. And we did end up with 255 responses, which, in a survey, I think it's safe to say you always want more responses than what you actually have. But with the data that we had, we did feel like it was representational. The thing that surprised me the most here was actually from a financial perspective. You can see that these range from being very small, under $25,000 annual budgets, all the way up to groups that are larger than $15 million annual operating budgets. And that is a huge variety of organizations. We also saw some really dynamic differences in industries. And so looking across all these different industries that were represented, so international groups, philanthropic groups, childcare, legal, we did have some centralization around education, human services, health and wellness, as I mentioned earlier, but this is a pretty wide swath of different organizations with different backgrounds. So we felt really comfortable with that the data was representational of the broader DC market. I will say, and I think I said this earlier, that a survey is really just a moment in time. And so, you don't know if you were to do the survey again, you don't know if you would necessarily get the same organizations or different organizations, but we do feel that we had some statistically interesting and significant data points that were worth exploring. But I will say that with any survey, at least when I look at data, it ends up presenting more questions and comments than necessarily providing answers. But I think we have some really good data to start thinking through here.
Thank you, Liz. And I will add to that, that while it was a small respondent pool compared to those who received the tool to complete, the pool was representative of the registered 501c3s in the District of Columbia by size and mission, if that resonates with you. So that was very helpful to us. What we also know with this pool is that we have access to the individuals for follow-up, deeper interviews to get more of the detail on both the COVID-19 impact as well as the race inequities that our findings uncovered. There's another question here, and it's about the 26% of male directors. And the question is whether or not those directors were white or was the demographic multicultural. I think this relates to one of the final few slides and data.
Yeah, that is an interesting, it's this slide here. Interestingly, no, they were not all white. It was a multicultural response. So I don't know why, but that's where the data landed. So it is an interesting point for sure.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I'm going to jump into one more of the questions, and then I'm going to pass to you, Director Scales, for some reflection before we go further into the questions that we received. But this was a very good sort of three-part question, and this came from Kish Rusick, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the question was, are there specific trainings, what specific trainings are there for nonprofits that they can offer their staff and board to address racial equity? And I'll say that amongst a number of entities and organizations, the center's new Center for Race, Equity, Justice, and Inclusion is offering a good number of opportunities for organizations. We have a very specific leadership series for Black professionals. So we're looking at culturally specific engagement opportunities to provide support and to build trust and sharing of best practices. There are lots of conversations, and this data has sparked quite a few around inequities in general. And that has been a barrier for many organizations for a very long time, especially diverse organizations being able to have these conversations. So lots of forums, convenings, specific trainings, as well as technical assistance and some very tangible offerings we'll continue to share with ServDC and the team, and I'm sure you all will receive that information as well. Another part of this question was how can nonprofits make job descriptions more inclusive? And one of the things we have found is just to do that in itself and to indicate some of the racial equity agenda for the organization, to really lay out and document culture and to create priorities around diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization. We like two things. One, for race equity to show up in policy and documents just as much as ADA information shows up. We like when someone can identify and call out racial injustice in an organization just as they can sexual harassment. And I think both of those things are things that were not as common at one time, but a steady drumbeat of training and focus has made them that much more common. And that's the goal for race equity within organizations cross-sector. Last question, and I'm going to pass to Director Scales of this three-parter, was what best practices make an organization actually feel inclusive of all colleagues? And I think a lot of the pieces I touched on earlier will bring that inclusivity into an organization, as well as some board level, high bylaw policy level changes that call out equity and make it common practice and commonplace. So I'm going to pass to you, Director Scales, for thoughts before we go into the remainder of questions.
Fantastic. Every time I hear this information, it's reaffirming, but it's also, it continues to be enlightening. And I love the kind of three-parter that Kish asked as it related to what the organizations can do. I thought it was, for me, a good transition, and not to put you guys on the spot, and even everyone who's on can participate. But it's, with this data, with this information, what can we do, or what are some things that we should be considering as government grant making agency and government grant making leaders, particularly as we want to make sure that we're not just doing business as usual. And now that we have an enlightenment of what the landscape is, what are some things that we may be able to do to apply towards the way that we move forward, or some considerations that we should take? Would encourage people to also, drop things in the chat as it relates to that question. But I didn't know, Glenn or Liz, if there were some things that you wanted to share with us as well, a little dialogue exchange.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And I think it's really powerful for you all at Serve DC to bring this conversation forward for grant making agencies within the District of Columbia. And I think it was also powerful for the data to uncover that our Black-led organizations were experiencing a different set of challenges than white-led organizations during this global pandemic. I will say that I don't think those challenges just occurred at the beginning of 2020. I think it has been a history of not funding or not, prioritizing capacity building, which helped those organizations to not be ready. And I think one of my coaches used to always say, if you stay ready, you never have to get ready. But prioritizing that, proactively building capacity internally really prepares an organization for emergencies and for crisis management. I'll point to another study done by Washington grant makers, a 2019 giving study, during which the responding foundations indicated in totality that less than 3% of all grant making across the region went to organizations led by people of color. So under 3% of all of the investment in the region went to organizations led by people of color throughout 2019. So what we could do, I think, is create greater priority around capacity. Many of our funders fund mission and mission only, but building the strength of the organization collectively to be more sustainable and more prepared is a great area to fund and support, and an area for accountability to ensure that as organizations report in the interim and their final reports, that they actually did what they proposed to do around organizational strengthening. And I'll pause there. Anything on your front, Liz?
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. I would echo everything that Glenn just shared. The only thing that I might add is it really struck me around how on that 5-point scale, at a 3.8 on a 5-point scale, people are having conversations, but they're at 1.3 on that same 5-point scale about feeling equipped to actually do the work in the community. And so, some of that is funding, some of that is training. There are a lot of different, some of that is capacity. There's a lot of different reasons and issues behind that. But I think that that's a place where I'd like to see people focus a little bit, is not just having the conversation, but talking about how to operationalize that from a service delivery and from an impact perspective. So I think there's definitely some funding and training support that can happen there. Yeah,
I love that you bring up the operationalizing piece. We did a 4-part series. The first 2 were on volunteer engagement and how to maximize volunteers. And the last 2 were really around aligning your intentions and your actions, right? So we have a lot, and we were engaging with philanthropic leaders, institutional foundation leaders around how to align their grant making and their actions and operations to these intentions that are now being vocalized. And so I even challenge us as district grant making, agencies, that I saw someone put in the chat, more support for capacity building for nonprofits. I go, well, hey, when you go back to your office or you go back to your working on next year's funding or your next round of funding, wherever you have opportunities to have some flexibility with how you reimagine or reevaluate what a grant looks like that comes out of your office, take into account what has been shared today. And so, yes, we do have grants that we have to give out that we don't have a lot of flexibility with. But sometimes as I talk with my team, it's like, what's new, better, different? And so if we have funds, new funds, or funds that we can go back and reevaluate what we allocate that towards. So if it's less programming and more capacity building, or less services and more outreach, that we take that liberty to do that. And so while it's important around the capacity building piece, I also wanted to raise that we look at making sure that we also have in place evaluation criteria that takes into account a more inclusive lens, right? That we can't necessarily have the same evaluation requirements for, maybe a more stable, larger budget led organization versus one that might just be emerging, that may be, having a smaller budget or more limited operations and resources. Because when you compare those two, pound for pound, every time there will be some level of inequality. And so how we also look at the data that our grantees are sharing with us and how they're capturing data. It's like, how does that help us inform our approach to making sure that we're more equitable and more encompassing in terms of how we're allocating resources in the district?
Yes, I think that's right on target and resonates with me very strongly. There's a question here in the chat, and it was about board development in the study and whether or not anything was done relative to board development. So I'm gonna allow Liz to talk about board respondents, but as I get ready for that, I do want to share how important it is for our boards to be strong of our organizations, and that our funders don't often see that as criteria or create requirements tied to resources about our boards. So board development is something we take really seriously at the center, lots of training and development for board members and for the board as a whole, as well as the way in which they're governing the organization. And I think for fundraising and other requirements, to bring it full circle to this Giving Tuesday, the organizations that will do the best today are those that were preparing 12 months ago, building their marketing and outreach, ensuring that they're high stars on Charity Navigator and GuideStar, all of the things that boards can help drive. So board development, really important. And Liz, I'll throw to you for the board participation in the study.
Yeah, so interestingly, we did not get a lot of responses from board members. Only 4% of the respondents indicated that they were board members. We did ask a number of questions around how boards were engaging in work, if they were engaging in DEI work. We also asked about different components of demographics as far as composition of a board and how that reflects the community, whether there are community respondents that are on the board. So we did ask some questions about that, but the board as a whole was not heavily responded to, nor was it something that the survey necessarily focused on specifically, but I do think it's a really important topic.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Liz, I know we have you for just a few more minutes, so I'll let the rest of us know that as we move into the discussion phase, we'll keep that going, but we'll lose Liz in just a few minutes. And that was Mrs. Price's question about board governance, by the way. So I think we have a big question here, Dr. Eaton, and what government oversight and protocols are there to ensure government accountability, equity, and fairness in the grant and contract decision-making and award processes. Director Scales, do you want to touch on some of those practices, or would you like me?
No, so I would say, you know, for the district government, we have been, what's the word? So the way in which we proceed has been traditionally overseen, advised, et cetera, by our grants manual here in the district. It has all of the criteria, and, you know, from how to select peer reviewers, how to create evaluation criteria, timelines, and things of that sort. And from, you know, every few years, we will go through a process of making sure that we update that manual. That manual and those responsibilities are now actually managed by the city administrator's office. But to that regard, I think that this is a great opportunity for us to go back and look at what we have in the existing manual, which has not been updated maybe since 2017 officially, sometime around there. And so there could be an opportunity. I know Kish is probably like, okay, Eris, but you know, there could be an opportunity to convene a working group, which is traditionally how that happens, to really look at, do we have practices and policies and procedures in here that allow us to be as equitable as we can be with our grant making. So that's one. So I always encourage every grant maker to refer to the district's you know, grant manual and source book. And the same applies with our RFP process with the Office of Contract and Procurement. And so we do, as a district, try to make sure that we're, you know, using local vendors, that we're supporting local entrepreneurs, you know, entrepreneurs and even organizations of color. But we could definitely work, I think, to do a refresh on the source book. The other thing that I would share is the source book is just the baseline, right? It's not, because what may work for you know, DHS in terms of its grant making may not work for Serve DC in terms of our grant making. So we always share with agencies that that's the baseline, but you can yourself, right, look at ways that you can add additional criteria so long as it's legal and, you know, and approved by general counsel, but look at how you can add additional criteria or processes that allow you to be more equitable. And so even with why we're doing this today is so that we can start having these conversations, becoming more aware. And Liz was saying, you know, that, you know, a lot of folks are receiving the information, they're receiving the training, but they don't feel equipped to begin to apply it or to roll it out. And the best way to apply it and to roll it out is just to do it. And so as much as we can bring you the information and keep connecting you to the resources and being a support for you, we're happy to do that, and how you shape those things going forward.
Awesome. Awesome. So before we go further, I do want to shed some light on how important it was for us to commission this research, and how hard it was for us to commission the research. I think when, like any other nonprofit organization, when there is a crisis, you want to jump right in and solve the problem. The hardest thing for us to do is pause and study what we think we already know. But commissioning this research from Brighter Strategies, Dr. Liz Scott and the team, was the smartest thing the center could have done to get scientific data to back up our action agenda for how we work to address this issue and these needs. Understanding exactly where we are was important. And I think the point that Liz made, suggesting that, you know, this data is a moment in time, really helps us to know that we need this moment on a regular basis to ensure we are on the right track, because the environment is changing so quickly. So I want to thank Liz for that and her team for helping us to go forward. Liz, any final points from you before you have to pop off?
No, it was a pleasure working with you guys. And I think that the data that we got, I know I said this earlier, but data just creates more questions. And it's, to me, it's exciting, right? So we've got this moment in time. We can see, we have tangible proof that things are happening in our community. And now we can begin to have conversations around how do we build capacity and strengthen organizations, particularly organizations led by people of color, since the data shows that those organizations are struggling with different components. And so that's, there's the funding piece, there's the capacity piece. And then for white-led organizations, it's the DEI conversation and helping them have that conversation, particularly for organizations, and we don't know what race they are, but organizations led by men, there's another conversation starter there to be had. And so I think, what this does is it just creates space for people to come together and to begin to build community and to strengthen the sector. And so I think we've got some really good data points. And to Director Scales' point, now it's about action. It's about how do we take this and move forward with it. So we were honored to be a part of it. And I know that the slides are up on the center's website, so people can certainly access that there. And I believe there's also a recording of a more in-depth presentation as well if people want the longer version, if you want to get a little deeper into the data. So thank you so much for including me today.
Awesome, awesome, thank you. And to Director Scales, to your point on, to Dr. Eaton's question about oversight and the suggestion that we can add requirements or sort of, adapt to make greater requests of nonprofits. I think it talks right or ties right into Kish's point here, where she asked, as district government grant makers, would you recommend that we request some of those new and revised policy documents from nonprofits to evidence their commitment to racial equity and DEI? And I will say to you, from my many years working with nonprofits, if organizations never pick their head up, if they're always focused on mission, they pick it up when a funder or foundation reaches out and says something. So the mere effort of asking the question
would have been done better to ensure equity for the players.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that sometimes our sub-recipient organizations who do not get funded or get funded at a certain level where they could barely do, they have been tasked to do because of the funding levels, it could be perceived that it is because of their organizational makeup. So what could we do to ensure that our decisions are as objective as possible, to rule out a lot of the subjectivity that comes along with the decision-making process? And I know that we don't have people to necessarily look over our shoulders, so we have to abide by rules of integrity and ethics within that process, but a lot of times they get muddy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that going to the source book is fine, but I do not know if there are guidelines for the ethical and objective decision making in those documents.
Got it. Got it.
So is there any way that we could also make it some sort of requirement that anybody who is tasked with making decisions on grants or contracts, that they have to take an oath or a pledge or go through a course that ensures that their decision making is going to be sound, ethical, legal, because a lot of times there may be instances where we get the grievance that comes back, and those could lead to lawsuits and all kind of other problems for the district.
No, I'll be in the building tomorrow.
That's great. Really good point. I'm going to ask whoever
Yes,
may
you don't.
not be muted to
Yeah.
mute their line.
I'm pretty good. I had someone on my team who
I
was
see
sick, and
Tyrus
HR
Brooks.
helped them quite a bit. So we just had, even though she hadn't been
Glenn,
in the
are you
building,
now?
Yeah.
I was able to give her
Can you mute-
guidance and
can you
help
mute
her
your
with her
line?
timesheet and afford her
Can you mute her? Are you
paid
now the
leave
administrator?
specific
Or
Yeah,
the
I'm
host?
just here.
for COVID diagnosis. So I suggest that they reach out to HR.
I don't have the mute button on my
Mhm.
side.
They call it COVID.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
Brooks.
so reach out
It's
to,
Brooks.
That came up with the
Yeah.
Somebody get her before
so
she.
yeah, have them reach out to Tracy Langley. She'll help them.
So you don't see where you can mute everyone?
Oh, she's
There you go.
muted now. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Right. I wish I could take credit for having muted her, but I didn't do that. So keeping the conversation going, Dr. Eaton, thank you for your points. I knew there was a reason that I was connected to your image on this Zoom. And Director Scales, as we were all gathering back together, I asked Dr. Eaton to share a quick reflection, and he also got a great question in there. I think the importance of the center's new Center for Race, Equity, Justice, and Inclusion is that it is a cross-sector offering and resource. So it's not just for nonprofits, but also government agencies, philanthropy, and others. And training is important, awareness is important. And as different grant-making entities become more aware and are able to shape their requests and their giving around a more equitable framework, I think we all benefit and the organizations benefit as well. So I think a part of your question relative to an oath is more high level and probably coming through the office of the mayor and the district. But from a more tangible decision-making standpoint per agency, much like ServDC and Director Scales and her team, there's an opportunity to shape your particular agency as aware and as effectively as you'd like. So that opportunity is there. There's lots of training. There's race equity audits that can be done of the agency itself, and more awareness of who we're funding and just the impact that that funding is having. I saw another question here by Ms. Price, and it's the push for HBCUs to be brought in the fold of working between government and nonprofit organizations, such as providing program evaluations, leading strategic planning processes to help build capacity, et cetera. And the question is, what is the push? And I'll just give a little highlight here from my perspective, and maybe Director Scales, you can jump in on this. And I think a big part of the push is our HBCUs now having nonprofit management programs and offerings tied to their business schools. And there being clear opportunity for those students, master's level students in most cases, to be engaged in community development through strengthening nonprofits in a way that helps them advance toward their degree and also helps the community as a whole. So many of our HBCUs are now getting those students involved. Some of that training is happening with us at the center, preparing people. There are internships and practicums that are placing students within organizations as a way to build new strength. And I'll tie back to the data statistic that suggested many of the volunteer workforce was lost due to the pandemic. And here is another way to bring support system that is at a reasonable cost into organizations that can also be effective. Director Scales, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's excellent. I think the only other piece that I would add too is, with that push and seeing this increase in collaboration and partnerships and wanting to see more of an increase in collaborations and partnerships comes back to those of us who are leading these efforts and just being intentional, right? And so, historically, and I'm a proud HBCU alum, so, Clark Atlanta University, AU. But, I think historically that the thought was that certain institutions and universities were better positioned or poised to support with research or to support with capacity building, or brought more validity or credibility to findings that would be issued or released by a government agency or another institution. And we know now that our HBCUs are more than equipped, more than qualified to be able to offer and support us with these capacity building opportunities and our research that couples the work and programs that we're putting out. And so if we're looking to design or we're looking to engage or address issues impacting communities of color and predominantly rural and or urban markets, it's upon us to really think about who are the partners that we're bringing to the table and why are we bringing them to the table? And do they reflect the communities? Do they reflect the issues that we're trying to address? And so I think as more people are approaching the way that they design their methodologies and the way that they roll out their outreach and want to get the research, that you're seeing more HBCUs coupled with what Glenn is saying, that they now have the capacity and those arms in place being brought to the table. And so I would, continue to challenge us not to take any opportunity away from Georgetown, but if you can engage Howard or you can engage Bowie or, or UDC, why not? Unless there's some legitimate reason for why not, that we just have to be more intentional with that.
Awesome. Great points. And there is nothing stronger than an HBCU experience. Virginia State University, undergrad and grad, VSU.
All right, all right.
I love it, I love it. All right, so we have another question here from Asteria. Any recommendations regarding the extent to which an RFA can specifically request a desire to provide funding to a qualified Black-led or predominantly Black entity with the specific intent of equitable distribution of funds, particularly given the data we just provided? There may be hesitation given that grants are supposed to be open, fair, competitive, et cetera. Also, great point regarding preparing the review panel to think in terms of equity. Director Scales, I think this might be one for you.
Yep, I was going to say, you know, I always recommend when for designing out the criteria that if you have questions or concerns like this, consult with your general counsel and let them know the intentionality and what you're trying to achieve, and they may be able to work with you on how you design the grant, the RFA, you know, et cetera, the criteria in a way that's legal and ethical for the district. Because keep in mind, right, we have 13 offices under the Mayor's Community Affairs Office. We have African American Affairs, African Affairs, Latino Affairs. And that's not to say that anyone who falls outside of those demographics can apply to those grants, but those offices are targeting their grants towards very specific demographics to increase their capacity and to increase resources for those communities. So it's not that things can't be done. I think it's just a matter of how, and that's where general counsel and back to that source book comes into play.
Awesome. Fantastic. So we covered a great deal of ground, and I see Ms. Price with her hand up. Please jump right in. Your thought?
Sure. I want to jump back over to the HBCUs, specifically when it comes to making funding available as we are looking to reduce violent crime in our communities of color, and the research that goes, that surrounds violent crime. It's very hard to find grants that are available from a public health perspective, and that's outside of just working with law enforcement and HBCUs or something to that degree. But something that is a little bit more specific as far as the public health vantage point and using social work and working within those communities of colors that are extremely volatile because of violence and trauma, and addressing that from a Black perspective or even a Latino perspective or Afro-Latino perspective, utilizing what we have at HBCUs. And that's something historically that there's not been very much research on. And so how can we as a government agency pioneer that? Because oftentimes when those voices are heard, it may be heard by one or two individuals who attend a graduate program at like a Georgetown or like a GW, but it's not from the collective voice of the HBCU actually doing the work in the community to address the issues of the community. And where do you find those grants and help support nonprofit organizations and build their capacity to have relationships with HBCUs so that you can make that all possible? Because there's a huge disconnect. And I'm a graduate of an HBCU, and I remember what what it was like for me coming out of Central State University in 1997. It was extremely difficult to not only, find mentors for me, but to find opportunities. And it was a true struggle. And I don't think that even with having a linkage to nonprofit in the business section, that's going to be enough, because there are plenty of things that students don't know about grants professionals associations, about the NGMA. They're not targeting currently those HBCUs so that they even know that there are opportunities, to have to develop their workforce there.
Yeah, so my very high level, and I'll give it to Director Scales, really has been our focus on getting students engaged in general and understanding some of these career paths to be viable career paths. So lots of marketing and communications, lots of engagement, some adjunct lecturing, meeting students where they are on their campuses, and really making sure they understand and can have a full experience. And then there's the partnership with individual universities for those internships and those practicums, as I mentioned, so they have an experiential learning opportunity to tie what they're reading or hearing with real people who are in those roles who look like them. So I think more of that is very important. And yet one more thing that we can ask our grantees: how are you engaging students? What plans or processes are you utilizing to leverage interns as engaging partners for your organization, which may get them interested and help them to shape programs where they can bridge to universities as well. So one option there.
My
Yeah.
issue is with funding and just looking for that funding that will support that, because we have a whole plan ready to work with a local university and to like introduce them, but we're a government agency, so we're not a nonprofit organization, but we want to lead the charge in helping to build that capacity and to help with those program evaluations from that perspective. And so I guess my question is more along the line of who is providing said funding, where do you look for said funding, and then is there a push right now within district government with those agencies that have the funding capacity to do so, to start thinking along those lines? And with that, I'll mute myself.
Yeah, no, Ms. Price, thank you. And I'm happy to talk with you more offline on that, because it does seem to be an opportunity for corporate funding to fit that mold. And maybe it's a public-private partnership, yourself and a nonprofit, to apply for those resources. And I say corporate funding because there will be so much exposure to the brand or the entity that underwrote the initiative, which could lend itself to more business for that corporation, or a better sort of reputation, if you would, for community engagement. So happy to share more of that with you. And I'll put my email in the chat as well.
I see our Deputy Director for Partnerships and Engagement has hopped on the screen and unmuted herself. So I think she may have something to add here, and then I'll close it out.
Sure. I just wanted to, lovely points. I think this is really, as we can see by everyone joining back again, this is really important information and insights. I want to thank everyone who joined in today. I did want to add a point to Dr. Eden's thoughts about our peer reviewers. And I think certainly that is something that Serve DC has been thinking about, and really how to ensure that we have reviewers that reflect the work and the priorities and focus areas that we are looking to have impact. And to make sure that they are diverse, and really to empower them to know that this peer reviewing is really civic engagement. And so we really need to work to have that cohort to rely on as we start to evaluate who is deserving of these grant opportunities. So that's definitely something that I can certainly look more into and really put some focus around, but I would encourage us all to do so, that making sure that even as we talk about how to integrate our HBCUs, really, priming them to know that this is an entryway into grant making is really to serve as a volunteer, as a peer reviewer in the processes. And I will leave you there. Thank you so much.
And Mia, do you currently subscribe to our funding alert that we put out, which is okay? So so we have those opportunities. To Glenn's point, corporate, man, we Alexis is gonna smack my hand virtually, but we do work in our office with strategic initiatives to help build out partner, i.e. donor, sponsor support, right? And so in terms of like sitting down with agencies, we do this with with like the Mayor's Maternal Infant Health Summit and other initiatives where we have multi, agencies or it's public-private partnerships, and we want to bring additional funding to the table. And so once we understand what the program is and the objectives, we kind of scope out, oh, this would be a great opportunity to engage Johnson & Johnson, and this would be a great opportunity to engage Aetna or JP Morgan. And so we also have some of those existing relationships for business or corporations who, value supporting administrative priorities. And so happy to also just kind of touch base with you around this. That sounds exciting. I hadn't even really.
So with programming?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. No, it's
Okay.
programming, events, initiatives. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have a lot of ideas. I'm ready.
Just come with one. No, it's not. Just laying. That's great. I look forward to talking to you.
Awesome. So I will help get us ready for coming in for a landing here, and just saying that I'm so delighted that we were all able to come together to discuss what I think is critical data surrounding two major issues impacting not just nonprofit organizations, but all of us and our communities. When we look at what's happening with the pandemic and continuing to happen with COVID-19, it's reaching and cutting across all of our lives and all of our professional spaces. So having some data to understand how it's affecting the very nonprofits that often are called upon to close or fall in the gap is very important. And then when we look at race equity, so much on social media, on the news, the way it has played out in the unrest across the country and around the world, recognizing as well how that finds its way into our individual organizations, no matter nonprofit or government agency or philanthropic organization, it's present, and looking at ways proactively and intentionally to level the playing field, to create more equitable places and spaces is also important to us. So this has informed our action agenda and the way in which we will move forward. And I can tell by the questions and the dialogue here that you all are also focusing in that way. I want to thank Director Scales and the full team at Serve DC once again for having the foresight and the good partnership to align and partner with the center in a number of different initiatives, but to see a way in which that public-private partnership can really help elevate the full community and the effectiveness of our individual organizations. So thank you once more. We're not going anywhere. The slides will be made available. We will do more study in the midst of action and share that just as much. And happy to take from you any requests or recommendations for what else we can do to support you and the organizations you're funding. I'll throw to you.
This has been wonderful. I tell you guys, when I heard this information and we were having just kind of a check-in, as Glenn shared, we partnered together on multiple different things. And it's probably about 2 weeks, it wasn't even 2 weeks ago. And I was like, no, we have got to make sure, that our agencies get this information. And he graciously pivoted to make sure that could happen. And again, this was wonderful. And just seeing you all's reactions and your questions and the participation really, for me, validates that we need to continue to do more of this, not just for the nonprofits and residents that we engage through Serve DC, but for our agency partners here, so that we can begin to have even greater of a collective impact in serving our community. So I thank everyone for joining. Again, I thank my team, Alexis and Roll, for just getting it going so quickly. And we will make sure that you get the information. I want to encourage you all to stay connected, follow us, support the work, because we want to bring more of this as well to you. And share with us what you think that we could be bringing to you that's going to be more helpful. If you want to do a session around peer reviewers, absolutely, we're happy to do that. If you want to do an additional session around outreach for raising visibility and connecting more diverse organizations to funding opportunities, let us know, and we can certainly design and deliver things accordingly. Okay.
Awesome.
Happy Giving Tuesday, everyone.
Happy
Giving Tuesday. Okay. We have a new tradition now at Serve DC for Giving Tuesday.
That's right.
Yes. All right, guys. Have a fantastic day. Thank you so much, Glenn.
Thank you, everyone. My pleasure. Stay safe, you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.